Okay, students, this is Plants and Animals of Southern California, and today's episode is Southern California deserts. This is really a tale of two deserts. These are distinct from the California floristic province, but right over the hill, right on the other side of the mountains. The two deserts are the High Desert, or the Mojave Desert. And in the Mojave Desert, the summers are very, very dry. Essentially never rains in the summer. But the elevation's pretty high, so the winters can be quite cold with many freezes or frosts. In contrast, the Sonoran, also called the Colorado Desert, is a low desert. And that's the desert that's inland from San Diego. It has mild winters because it has low elevations, and it gets summer rains. There's thunderstorms in the rain, so it's like 105 degrees and it's raining. Just think, if you're a moss and you get wet and it's 105 degrees, you're dead. So we would predict there'd be very few mosses except for in seeps and cold places in the Sonoran Desert, whereas there might be many mosses in the Mojave Desert because they are just dreaming of winter time all summer. There's vascular plant differences between these deserts. There are many cacti in the Sonoran Desert, relatively few cacti in the Mojave Desert, although some, and that might be because of the winter frost. Also, Falquearia or Ocotillo is common in the Sonoran Desert right around, at least the California part. Whereas Joshua tree would be common in the high desert. There are many different plant species that differ between these two deserts, but these are some that are emblematic. Now, above the deserts, there's another zone that we also might consider the desert. This is the pinyon juniper woodland. And you can see it has little dotted green conifers every so often, but not great big trees. And the pinyon juniper zone has both pinyon pines and junipers, not always intimately mixed together. They themselves can be zonated or divided into zones. Pinyon pine you might know from eating pine nuts. This and a few other pine species make excellent pine nuts and were a delicacy for Native Americans. And then juniper you might know as the flavor of gin, although I don't think gin is really made in California. But where gin is made, the juniper berries are thrown in, and that gives it that special taste. So every few years, the rains are good and the flowers are great. Look at all those flowers. It's just beautiful. It covers the bottomlands of the desert. And there's many, many species that respond to these rains, that have special adaptations in their germination cues that allow them to come out right when it rains. And they don't come out at other times. So year after year, they won't come out when the rains are poor, and then when the rains are good, they cover the desert. And then they make copious numbers of seeds. And these copious numbers of seeds make the granivores ecstatic. The granivores in the desert consist of a guild of rodents, which includes the kangaroo rats, many species of kangaroo rats. There's also kangaroo mice, and then more ordinary mice and rats. And then ants. Ants also collect seeds, and those are special ants, different from, say, the ants that are getting into your house. A harvester ant would be an example of a granivore. So these animals compete with one another to collect all these seeds, and after a great seed year, they will flourish, and then they'll eat up many of the seeds. Of course, they don't find them all. Some of the seeds they don't find, and those are the seeds that will become the plants during the next rain. But they eat a great number of the seeds, and then after that, they get hungry. Herbivores are happy too. Here's a desert grasshopper, Snow's grasshopper, and it has a coloration kind of like the sands of the desert. And then what eats those granivores and herbivores are also happy for a while. Here's a western banded gecko and a long-nosed leopard lizard. That leopard lizard is a female, unlike in many species. The females are the colorful sex, and the males are relatively drab. And then, of course, there are also animals that eat those types of animals. Here's a burrowing owl. Burrowing owls live in fairly arid lands, deserts, and semi-arid places. They dig holes, and they have nice long legs and run around. And, of course, they can fly as well. And then there's snakes in the desert and elsewhere, but some of the snakes are slightly different species than the ones that we would have in the California floristic province. So here's a Mojave rattlesnake, also called a Mojave green. Here's some other organisms that you might see in the desert. Cactus wren first, amazing bird. They build their nests inside of cactuses, right amongst all these spines. If you stuck your hand in there, you would surely get spines all in your hand, and it would be very painful for a very long time. You'd have a very hard time getting all the spines out. But these little birds are able to fly in amongst the spines and never seem to have much of a problem at all. Perhaps the spines protect them from the likes of those rattlesnakes. And beep beep meow. Those are the greater roadrunner and coyote. And neither of these species is particularly restricted to the deserts, but both of them are common and abundant in the deserts, and it might be a good place to see them. Roadrunners like to eat grasshoppers and maybe a lizard if they can get one. Coyotes eat anything that they can possibly get, including plant material like fruits. Here's two lagomorphs. There's the desert cottontail, which is pretty much like Peter Rabbit. And then a hare, the jackrabbit. The hare has these great ears. And the ears are thought to be a way that the rabbit can kind of cool its blood by letting the blood go through the ears like a radiator. Both jackrabbits and cottontails live places outside of the desert. There's a different species of cottontail that's more common in California floristic province than in the desert, but they look essentially the same. Okay, so here's a little bit of data. This shows the rainfall in the Mojave Desert region, and you can see it goes up and down, lots of up and downs, and then there's long periods when it's a little bit drier or a little bit wetter. So there's cycles within cycles and a huge amount of variation in the rainfall. So this year we have essentially no rainfall in the desert until it's too late. And last year it was sort of an average year. And then we've had other years, of course, that are way above average. Here is a graph showing the quality of flowering in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. And where the blue lines go across the gray horizontal line, those are great years for flowering. Not so often, maybe about every 7th year. And then lots of the other years are not so great for flowers, and so not so great for seeds, and not so great for herbivores, and not so great for granivores. Those years that are great years, they tend to be El Nino years where there's an oscillation in the South Pacific that sends a lot of rainstorms that are kind of warm. They're called Hawaiian expresses or something like that. as opposed to the rainstorms that we get from Alaska, which are more drizzly and cold. During many years in the desert, there's relatively little moisture, and the plants are just sort of struggling along. We have the plants that live as seeds during those years, and then there's the cactuses, and there's the shrubs, and they persist from year to year as perennials, surviving by not using water. But not using water means that they are also not photosynthesizing very much. Deserts are defined by having fewer than 10 inches of rain per year on average. There's some years, of course, that have lots of rain, and then others that have much less. There's a big biogeographic break between the California Floristic Province, shown in red, that would be the area that has the Mediterranean climate, and the deserts. It's just a few miles from Los Angeles. You get out of the California Floristic Province and you go up a very, very steep ecological gradient, entering the deserts, which might be viewed as not really part of California proper. Same deal with San Diego. If you go over the hill into Anza Borrego, you've left the California Floristic Province. And a huge number of organisms that you would find in the California Floristic Province you will not find in the deserts, and a huge number of species that you find in the deserts you will not find in the California Floristic Province. How about evolution within the California deserts? Well, these deserts are relatively young. They've arisen in the order of tens of thousands of years, kind of growing from deserts that are in Sonora. And so there's been relatively little time for evolution to proceed and new species to arise. Also, many evolutionary biologists believe that evolution, or at least diversification, is strongest in areas with intermediate aridity, that is, in the Mediterranean climate of the California Floristic Province, and that diversification is slower and less likely in the deserts. So, as a consequence, compared to the California Floristic Province, we have few species that are narrowly endemic, that have very small ranges, relatively few species with very small ranges in the deserts of the Southwest. Most of the species, they follow elevational bands and extend into Arizona, Nevada, and beyond. Okay, so that's it for our little slideshow of the organisms of Southern California's deserts.